Adrian Newey doesn't usually talk about next year's car this early or in this much detail, so when he starts describing engine position, suspension concepts and gearbox architecture for the AMR27 before the 2026 season's even finished, it's worth sitting up and paying attention.
That's really what this video is about. What we can actually piece together right now about Aston Martin's 2027 car and why the timing behind it matters as much as the technical detail.
Let's start with what Newey's actually confirmed, because it's a lot more specific than the usual vague, we're already looking ahead line teams roll out at this point in a season. He says the team's in early research stages and they're deep into the big architectural decisions, where the engine sits in the wheelbase, how the front and rear suspension's conceived, the shape of the gearbox. None of that's a small detail you tweak later in the process. These are the long lead time choices that shape everything the aero department does afterwards. Get one of them wrong now, and you're carrying that mistake through the whole life of the car. Those decisions carry a lot more weight than they sound like on paper. Where the engine sits in the wheelbase shifts the car's whole weight distribution, and it decides how much room's actually left around the floor and diffuser once the aero team gets involved. The gearbox casing's doing something similar out back. People forget it's basically bodywork too, not just a mechanical box, and it shapes how air feeds into the diffuser and the rear wing. And suspension pickup points change how the wheel disturbs the air right next to it, which matters a lot on a floor-dependent car like this generation. Miss any of that now, and there's no clever bodywork trick later on that fixes it. Everything that comes after this stage is really just refinement. There's also a deliberate shift in how they're approaching the whole process, and on its own that tells you something about how badly this year got away from them. The 2026 car didn't go into the wind tunnel until April of last year, 4 months later than everyone else on the grid. Newey wants the AMR27 out to production a lot earlier than that, so the team isn't scrambling under the same pressure that defined the first half of this season. More time in the process means more room to actually get weight and stiffness right, rather than just finishing a car in time to race it.
So what's actually giving him the confidence to push this hard, this early?
Some of it's just regulation too. F1's moving away from the current 50-50 split between combustion and electrical power for 2027. Teams get 5% more fuel, and there are some changes to how energy gets stored and deployed. On the chassis side, there's less change overall, but one bit stands out. The leading edge of the floor, what people in the paddock call the bib or the T-tray, moves forward by around 300 millimeters. That lets teams run the front of the car lower, and it opens up a different aero picture than what everyone's working with now. Add a shallower rear wing to cut down force, the floor's front fingers dropping from 5 to 3, and the removal of a few exhaust and rear wing tricks teams have been leaning on, and every team's basically starting that part of the puzzle from scratch. That 300mm shift sounds tiny on paper, but it's worth breaking down what it actually changes. Right now, teams keep the front ride height fairly conservative because the plank underneath, the part that measures wear, sits close to that leading edge. Run the car too low over a race distance and you risk wearing it past the legal limit. Push the T-tray back 300mm and that wear plate moves back with it. Suddenly, teams can run the front lower, with more rake than they're allowed to today. Doesn't sound like much on its own, but ride height and rake are two of the biggest tools an aerodynamicist has for controlling how much load the floor generates. Shift where that limit sits, and you've shifted the entire window every team's designing inside. Newey's picked out that floor change as the one that matters most for 2027, more than the fuel number, even though on paper that sounds like the bigger deal. It's the floor edge that resets an area almost every current car's whole philosophy is built around, and it's not hard to see why that might suit him more than most. This is a guy who spent 3 decades finding performance other designers didn't know was there, mostly through the floor and underbody. A regulation reset in exactly that zone, with Aston Martin already committed to the architecture around it this early, is about as good a starting point as you could hope for if you're him. None of this happens in a vacuum either. Going back to how bad the start of this year actually was, helps explain why the AMR27 process looks so different now. Honda's own chief engineer, Shintaro Orihara, called it a big shock, and admitted the situation kept getting worse through January, even before pre-season testing exposed just how far off the pace both Aston Martin and Honda actually were. The vibration issue wasn't a minor annoyance either. It cut into testing mileage, complicated development of the chassis and the power unit at the same time, and got serious enough that Newey raised real concern about nerve damage to his own driver's hands. On top of that, Aston Martin hadn't fully grasped how much know-how walked out the door when Honda's old Red Bull era engineers moved on. Both companies were rebuilding chunks of their operation while also designing an entirely new power unit under the biggest rule change in years. Just to put it in context, they went into the summer break 10th in the Constructors' Championship, 1 point to their name, Alonso 19th, Stroll without a single point, down in 20th. And Newey's admitted the delay wasn't only about starting late in the tunnel. They found out the tunnel's own calibration was off and had to rebuild that correlation from scratch partway through the project. Building a whole car around data that turns out to be wrong is a rough place to start from. Might explain why correlation's getting so much attention this time round before they're deep into the AMR27, rather than finding out the hard way again in April.
You'd think a start like that would just be a write-off. So why does everyone involved sound more confident now than they did in March?
Listen to how Orihara talks about it though. Honda's brought back some of the more experienced engineers from previous programs, and the newer ones who joined fresh on this project have now been through a full winter and half a season under real pressure. He sounds confident the structure's in place to recover both performance and reliability, and Zandvoort's the next proof point, with Honda's first ADUO upgrade landing there, the allowance handed to manufacturers who are clearly behind the competitive benchmark. On the chassis side, there's already something to point at, rather than just promises. The Hungaroring update, 16 changed parts, gave Aston Martin their best weekend of the year, and it improved the car's balance and aero platform independently of anything happening with the engine. Stroll's called it a breakthrough. Alonso got into Q2 for the first time all season off the back of it. That's a team finally working from a base solid enough to actually build on, instead of firefighting every weekend just to bring both cars home. And that's roughly where Newey's own read on all this lands. He thinks being forced to grow up fast as an organisation over the last year has left them better placed for 2027 than they'd have been coming off a quiet, uneventful season. It's a genuinely interesting claim if you think about it, because most teams treat a bad year as pure loss. Points gone, development time gone, nothing to show for it. Newey's making almost the opposite argument, solving a vibration crisis, rebuilding engineering knowledge from scratch, correcting a wind tunnel delay under real pressure. All of that forces a level of organisational discipline a smooth season just doesn't. Whether that discipline shows up as actual pace in the AMR27 is impossible to say yet, and I'll be honest, nobody really knows that yet. Architectural decisions made in August don't tell you anything on a stopwatch until the car's on track, and that's well over a year away. We don't know the concept they've settled on for that front floor. We don't know how the suspension layout's going to play out once it meets the wind tunnel data. All we've really got right now is a process that looks different this time, earlier, more deliberate, built by a team that's just been through the worst version of getting a car wrong and had to fix it in real time.
Do you think a disaster season like this one actually helps build a better car for next year? Or is Newey just putting on a good face on a year that went badly wrong? Let me know what you think in the comments.